It is worrying, of course, but perhaps not overly surprising. The Australian ambassador to China was just refused entry to the trial.
Yeah, I think we probably expected that. The Chinese authorities have been very, very closed about this. And as we heard the ambassador say, he was told that this is because it's a national security case. The trouble is that I've been through this before. I was accused of terrorism charges. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, the Australian academic who was imprisoned in Iran, was accused of spying. And in both cases, there was absolutely nothing to the charges, but those allegations gave the authorities a lot of opportunities to close down the evidence, to close down observers to these cases. And I think we're seeing that in Cheng Lei's case. I know that the Chinese authorities will be wanting the respect of the public. They'll want the verdict to be understood and respected. And if they want that to happen, then they've got to be more transparent and open about the trial and the evidence against Cheng Lei. And the only way to do that, as far as I'm concerned, is to open up the trial to observers and in particular to Australian diplomats.
Do we have a clear sense of the specific allegations that she's facing, what it is she's accused to have done?
No, at the moment all we have is that she's accused of selling state secrets abroad, which sounds a lot like espionage. It is not an espionage charge, but it is a very vague and unspecific charge. We don't have any details whatsoever about exactly what lies behind the charge, what she's supposed to have done, what state secrets she's supposed to have sold and who she was supposed to have sold them to. We really don't know any more detail. And I think, as I said, that is what's particularly worrying. The fact that the authorities are able to arrest a journalist without being transparent about the allegations, without even being more specific about what she's been charged with is really worrying. And it is part of a trend that we're seeing globally where authorities are using vaguely worded national security laws to silence uncomfortable journalism. Now, we know that Cheng Lei had made a few critical remarks on social media about the Chinese government soon before she was arrested. And so in the absence of any other evidence, it seems that that's the main reason behind all of this, that she is a high-profile individual, that she's widely recognised and respected both inside China and outside it. And so the remarks that she made might have stung. I find it concerning that if that's the case, the Chinese authorities are quite so sensitive. But if it's not the case, then again, as I said, we really need to see the evidence. We really need to understand what it is that she's supposed to have done and what the evidence is.
Do we have a clear sense of the likely duration of the trial and also what sort of sentence Cheng Lei is facing?
Look, again, it's very, very difficult to say. The Chinese judicial system is generally pretty opaque. They have an extraordinarily high conviction rate of well over 90%, and so it looks highly likely that on that basis alone that she might well be convicted. The trials tend to be quite short. It may well only be the one day, although it could be some time, perhaps days, weeks, or even months before we end up with a verdict or a sentence. And again, the sentences vary wildly in this particular type of charge, from life imprisonment down to the time that she's already served. And I would hope that, given that she has already spent a considerable amount of time in prison, I think it's something like 19 months, that is more than enough for her and that she will be released immediately. That would seem to be the best option that might satisfy everyone, that the Chinese get a conviction and Cheng Lei gets to come home.
Peter, how is her family coping? Do we know much about how much access they've had to her and how that access has extended to lawyers and to the Australian diplomatic staff there in Beijing?
Look, all I know is what we just heard from the ambassador, who said that he had been getting regular consular access, monthly consular access to Cheng Lei. We do know that she hasn't had any opportunities to speak to her children, her young infant children. I don't know a great deal more about the access that she's had to her family. We haven't had a great deal of communication with the family. But either way, we do know that she's been held in pretty tough conditions. And it is, I think, a form of psychological torture, what she's going through. We know that she's been isolated. We know that she's been cut off from more routine and regular access to her family. We know that this trial has taken inordinately long to come through. And on all of those bases, this is, frankly, I think, an inhumane way of treating a prisoner. Even if she is guilty, it's not the right way to go about this.
Peter, some within diplomatic circles, as you well know, argue that quiet diplomacy is the smartest way to tackle cases like this. How hard did you have to think about speaking out, about keeping this story in the headlines?
Look, I think it's interesting. I've been talking to Kylie Moore-Gilbert about this, and she's just released her book, The Uncaged Sky, and in fact I'm going to be interviewing her this evening for the Brisbane Writers' Festival about this. And one of the things that we both agree is that even though diplomats' first instinct is to use what you just described as quiet diplomacy, to keep it out of the headlines, to allow negotiations to go on without the influence of noisy, shouty social media, both Kylie and I have come to the really solid view that actually public support, public pressure really does help. It supports the diplomats because it gives them the political weight that they need to go into these negotiations and negotiate quite forcefully. But equally for the authorities who are holding holding suspects like Cheng Lei, it does add pressure. The Chinese might say that they don't care what the Australian public think, but we've both Kylie's experience in Tehran, in Iran, and my experience in Egypt is that the authorities are sensitive to it, that it does matter to them, and that when there is noisy public campaigning, people respond, the authorities respond, the conditions tend to improve. And I'm absolutely certain that I would still be in prison in Egypt if it weren't for that very noisy, very vocal public campaign. Now, as I said, I recognise that the diplomats don't always like it because they can't control the messaging. But certainly we came to the view that the authorities in Egypt were capable of making a distinction between the really noisy, sometimes nasty, vitriolic messages that were coming from social media and the much more measured, considered messages that were coming from my family. And I think that would also be the case in China's case, particularly when it comes to Cheng Lei's situation.
Peter Greste, you have such unique insight into all of this, and we appreciate you sharing that with us today. Best of luck for your advocacy, and we'll be watching developments there in Beijing today as closely as we can. Thank you.